Darth Plagueis had long studied the secrets of life and death, devoting his every waking moment to manipulating the Force in ways that had never been achieved before. He believed in the power of midichlorians, in the ability to twist and sculpt living energy, to reshape a being's destiny or halt their demise. Over many years, through both cunning and patience, Plagueis collected arcane knowledge, confident that he had transcended the boundaries set by the mortal coil. When his apprentice, Darth Sidious, sensed his master's vulnerability in the waning hours of a dark night, he struck with lethal intent. Plagueis, however, was no ordinary Sith Lord. In those final moments, Plagueis had already woven a backup plan into the tapestry of the Force. He appeared to die, breath stilled and eyes vacant, while Sidious reveled in triumph. Yet Plagueis' consciousness clung to the edges of that unholy knowledge, tethered by a thread to his body. In the hidden recesses of the Force, Plagueis waited for the slightest chance to reclaim the corporeal realm. Sidious, now calling himself Palpatine in public life, departed the private chambers, quietly disposing of the evidence of the murder. He believed that Plagueis had died. Freed from the looming shadow of his master, he continued to ascend the corridors of power in the Galactic Republic. Over the following weeks, Sidious never suspected Plagueis' spirit was struggling to keep its link to a half-living body. And so Plagueis lay silent, using the Force to stitch together what had been mortally undone. Over time, his muscles and bones formed a tenuous connection to life once more. His resurrection was gradual, a grotesque masterpiece of the dark side. Plagueis awakened from his catatonic state, body broken but mind intact, swirling with rage and cunning. The lingering ache of betrayal seared his every breath, but he quieted the pain with the power of the Force. He recognized that his survival depended on secrecy. The new Dark Lord, Sidious, had seized control of the Sith's future. Plagueis could feel Sidious's presence shining in the Force with that familiar aura of cold ambition. Rather than seeking immediate revenge, Plagueis bided his time, healing in the darkness, sustaining himself on the scraps of illusions and stealth. It was as if he floated between life and death, a being now redefined by unnatural means. The galaxy turned, years passed, and Plagueis faded from common lore even among the few who whispered of the Sith. In time, the long-forgotten master shaped himself into a figure unrecognizable to any who might have known him. Hunched and cloaked in black, he traveled the outer rim, tracking rumors of an emerging destiny. He heard whispers of a boy prophesied to bring balance to the Force, someone deemed by the Jedi as the Chosen One. Plagueis thought of how ironically perfect that was. He had once believed he possessed the power to unlock immortality. Perhaps the Force was offering him a tool to finish what he had started. The faint traces of knowledge pointed to a sandy planet called Tatooine, and so Plagueis set a new course. By the time he arrived on Tatooine, Anakin Skywalker was already a young boy purchased by the Jedi Knight Qui-Gon Jinn's persuasion. The Jedi and the boy had departed for Coruscant, leaving behind a swirl of speculation about a miraculous child who excelled at pod racing and radiated a magnitude in the Force unlike any other. Plagueis knew at once that this must be the one. Anakin. He felt a spark of dark anticipation. If the boy's power could be harnessed, Plagueis might manipulate the Force to new depths. Perhaps the manipulations he had performed before would be outdone by what he could accomplish with the Chosen One at his side. Cautiously, Plagueis traced the boy's path all the way to Coruscant. He arrived on the city planet whose surface glittered with 1,000,000,000 lights in the eternal night. The unending spires of the Senate District soared above like steel monoliths. The Jedi Temple loomed in the distance, an austere building housing the keepers of the light side, who were ironically blind to the darkest secrets twisting under their own watch. Plagueis prowled the lower levels, immersing himself in the forgotten districts far beneath the shining towers. There, corruption and shadows converged, a realm that would welcome a specter like him. As he wandered the Undercity, Plagueis pieced together rumors about the boy's training, gleaning scraps of intelligence that the boy had begun his Jedi path. Yet Plagueis felt something else stirring, a shift in the Force. He recognized the cunning hand of Sidious, his faithless apprentice, rising in political power. The shape of Sidious's plan was not fully known to Plagueis, but he suspected it involved sowing chaos and conflict on a galactic scale. The boy, it appeared, would soon be at the center of it. The Jedi had accepted Anakin, though Plagueis understood well how the Jedi Council hesitated at training him. This was a child ripe for shaping. If guided gently, he could be turned from the Jedi's limited perspective toward a more expansive mastery of the Force. Plagueis remained hidden, letting years slip by as Anakin grew under Obi-Wan Kenobi's mentorship. Meanwhile, Plagueis periodically inserted subtle influences into the galaxy's outskirts. He made sure to keep track of every rumor about the boy's progress. The swirl of prophecy around Anakin only intrigued Plagueis more. The old Sith Lord suspected that the Force had created the boy, or that his own ancient experiments with midichlorians had somehow contributed to the boy's birth. If that was true, Plagueis had a unique bond with Anakin, though it was intangible. During the Clone Wars, Plagueis observed from the shadows. The conflict was orchestrated by Sidious, who was now the Supreme Chancellor, and the galaxy was locked in a state of war. Anakin served as a Jedi Knight, fighting valiantly in countless battles. Plagueis sensed the young man's growing frustration, his recklessness, the seeds of fear and anger that blossomed in him whenever tragedy struck. He was a time bomb waiting to explode into the dark side, and Plagueis wanted to be the one to cultivate that metamorphosis. But to do so openly was impossible. While Sidious's watchful eye consumed everything of note. Using clandestine resources built up over decades, Plagueis managed to infiltrate some aspects of the war that Sidious had not carefully guarded. He used coded transmissions, hidden saboteurs, and disguised informants. Each time, Plagueis probed the possibility that he might contact Anakin. But the swirl of battles, the watchfulness of Obi-Wan Kenobi, and the strong presence of the Jedi Council forced Plagueis to remain patient. Meanwhile, he kept a careful distance from Sidious's schemes, not wanting to tip his former apprentice off to his survival. Anakin's frustration with the Council eventually grew into resentment. Plagueis saw that Sidious was nurturing the boy's doubts, maneuvering to convert him into an ally. Plagueis recognized the Sith hallmark in Sidious's manipulations. The desire to claim Anakin as an apprentice. The threat of losing the boy to Sidious stoked the old master's ire. Plagueis had not painstakingly survived and hidden from the galaxy only to watch his treacherous apprentice claim the most valuable Force-sensitive in living memory. He had to act swiftly yet with surgical precision. At last, Plagueis decided to risk a subtle encounter. He orchestrated an accident on a disputed Outer Rim planet, one where Obi-Wan and Anakin would be assigned to mediate. The war had drawn them thin, and the Republic was eager for Jedi involvement to quell local insurgents. Plagueis arrived on the planet under a masked identity, disguised as a humble diplomat. He learned the precise moment the Jedi would arrive, and he engineered a moment to speak with Anakin alone. As Plagueis's plan took form, a political skirmish on the planet threatened to erupt into bloodshed. The arrival of Obi-Wan and Anakin seemed to calm tensions, at least for a time. Anakin, walking with the local governor to observe relief efforts, found himself separated from Obi-Wan by a chaotic moment in the city center. Plagueis, clad in a featureless robe and a battered breath mask, approached from the shadows. He spoke in a voice modulated to sound like an old, sorrowful being caught in the conflict. Anakin turned and offered his help, always eager to assist anyone in need. Plagueis wove subtle illusions in the Force to keep onlookers away, leaving him and the young Jedi in an almost private bubble. He spoke of having once known the ancient lore of midichlorians, of life and death. He dropped half-veiled hints about the boy's potential, how the Force had never seen his like before, and how his destiny was not as simple as the Jedi believed. Anakin's eyes narrowed with both curiosity and caution. He had heard from Palpatine that there were ways to save those one cared about from death, and here was a stranger hinting at the same. For a moment, Anakin almost dismissed it as a trick, but the quiet resonance in the Force told him this being was not lying. Something deep and true emanated from the stranger. A power that Anakin could sense was old and suffused with a knowledge that might be beyond even Master Yoda's. Before Anakin could press for more, Obi-Wan reappeared, concerned by the mysterious figure. Plagueis smoothly excused himself, whispering something in Anakin's ear so softly that Obi-Wan did not hear. That small phrase, "Seek me when the Jedi fail you," lodged itself in Anakin's mind. The older Jedi did not sense the dark current curling around them, for Plagueis concealed his presence behind masterful Force illusions. Obi-Wan felt only vague unease, but he found no reason to detain the hooded figure. Plagueis slipped away into the throng, like a ghost dissolving in a dream. Anakin could not purge from his thoughts that odd presence, that subtle glimmer of an answer to a forbidden question. He felt an odd stirring in his chest, a sense of yearning for greater knowledge. Yet the war called him away, and so he buried it beneath duty for a time. Plagueis returned to the shadows, content with having planted a seed. As the Clone Wars escalated, Plagueis continued to watch from his hidden vantage. The cunning manipulations of Sidious were reaching a crescendo. Anakin grew closer to Palpatine as the Chancellor, confiding in him about his doubts in the Jedi Council. Plagueis recognized the signs that Sidious would soon reveal his Sith identity to the boy, ensnaring him. If that happened, Plagueis would face a far more difficult time swaying Anakin away. The moment to intervene drew near. On one tumultuous night, Plagueis initiated a second encounter. Knowing that Anakin often visited the lower levels of Coruscant to chase leads or quell criminal disturbances, Plagueis designed a confrontation in a deserted hangar bay. He arranged for a band of mercenaries, all unknowingly financed by him, to cause havoc there. Then he leaked intelligence to the Jedi Temple about smugglers in that location. Sure enough, Anakin arrived with a small squad of clone troopers. The mercenaries engaged in a pitched firefight, but Plagueis ensured the squad was pinned down, leaving Anakin alone to chase the leaders deeper into the facility. In the gloom of that corridor, Plagueis awaited. Anakin barreled in, lightsaber flashing blue arcs through the darkness. The mercenaries scattered, having fulfilled their role. Plagueis stepped into the corridor, bathed in flickering emergency lights. The young Jedi recognized the shrouded figure at once, though Plagueis now wore a slightly different disguise. The memory, however, was too distinct to ignore. That aura of deep, arcane knowledge, that calm, poised control of the Force, it was unmistakable. Anakin ignited his saber and demanded to know who this mysterious stranger was and what he wanted. Plagueis, unafraid, lifted his hands in a placating gesture. He said he meant no harm, that he came to impart truth. Anakin, suspicious yet drawn by a powerful curiosity, lowered his weapon slightly. Plagueis began to speak of how the Jedi had failed to see the full spectrum of the Force, how they restricted themselves by dogma. He spoke of how one could learn to save the ones they loved from death, an ability that the Jedi refused to explore. That final mention struck the core of Anakin's deepest fears and desires. The young Jedi had been haunted by dreams of loss. His mother, and soon visions of his wife, Padme, in anguish. Anakin's eyes flared with passion. He demanded to know what Plagueis knew. In answer, Plagueis lifted a gloved hand, letting the Force manifest around him in subtle, serpentine shadows. He said that if Anakin truly sought to protect those he loved, he must learn from someone who had walked the deeper labyrinth of the Force. Plagueis did not name himself. He only implied that he was an outcast from both Jedi and Sith, someone who had discovered secrets lost to time. That was enough to spark a fierce hunger in Anakin. Torn between his loyalty to the Jedi and the pang of yearning in his heart, the young man hesitated. Plagueis dipped his head and offered a cryptic promise. "We will speak again when the Force wills it." Then the robed figure stepped backward into a shroud of swirling dust and vanished, leaving Anakin alone with the echoes of that proposition. The troopers arrived moments later, but found no sign of the stranger. Anakin found himself telling them that the intruder must have escaped. He withheld the deeper revelation that churned within him. Something about that being felt ancient, and though Anakin did not know it, something in him felt intimately connected to that presence. The Force shifted like an inexorable tide around him. In the following weeks, Anakin began to search Coruscant's underlevels for signs of the hooded figure. Tensions with the Jedi Council were rising. The Council wanted Anakin to spy on the Chancellor, suspecting Palpatine was twisting events to suit his own ends. Meanwhile, Palpatine was confiding in Anakin, tempting him with knowledge of the dark side's ability to save Padme from a terrible fate. On top of it all, Anakin was plagued by nightmares of Padme dying in childbirth. Confused, desperate, and feeling increasingly alone, Anakin found his thoughts drifting back to the masked figure's promise. Perhaps that being possessed the key to saving Padme. Eventually, Plagueis sensed Anakin's search and chose a precise moment to reveal himself. Under the harsh neon glow of a deserted walkway bridging two skyscrapers in the lower districts, Plagueis stepped out from behind an array of ventilation units. Cloaked as before, he let Anakin see him only once they were completely alone. The wind howled in the hollow space, carrying the sounds of distant speeders. This time, Anakin did not hesitate. He demanded knowledge. He demanded to know how to prevent death. Plagueis could taste the desperation in the young man's voice. In soft, measured words, Plagueis spoke of ancient teachings, of an ability that required mastery over midichlorians. He said it was not a path for the timid, and that to wield such power, one had to embrace the Force in all its aspects. The good, the dark, the bright, the corrupt. The Force was not to be caged by moral definitions. Only total acceptance would grant the ability to reshape life itself. Anakin's eyes burned with conviction. He was at a crossroads, and Plagueis stood offering a path no Jedi would dare. Yet Anakin's conflict raged. Palpatine had implied he was the one who could teach him the power to cheat death. But Plagueis spoke of the same promise with an authority that felt somehow more profound, as if it had originated with him. Could they be connected? Could Palpatine and this shadowy figure be part of the same conspiracy? Anakin's mind swirled, but Plagueis, sensing the confusion, placed a gentle hand on the Jedi's shoulder. Through the Force, Plagueis projected calm and possibility. The old Sith Lord told him to remain wary of all those who might manipulate him, including the Chancellor, including the Council. But Plagueis promised that he alone had actually probed the secret of immortality. Palpatine might know a fragment of the story, but Plagueis claimed he was the originator. The lure proved irresistible, though Anakin could not bring himself to openly betray the Jedi at that moment. He agreed to meet with Plagueis again and hear more. Plagueis then slipped a small data chip into Anakin's palm, with coordinates to a remote location beyond Coruscant's mid-levels. He vanished once again, leaving Anakin reeling. That night, Anakin visited Padme, who was visibly pregnant now. He had nightmares of her dying, of darkness snatching her away. Fear gnawed at his heart. The more the Council stonewalled him, the stronger the pull toward Plagueis and the forbidden knowledge became. He felt the Jedi's distrust, their murky intentions, and their hypocrisy in using him to spy on the Chancellor. At the same time, the Chancellor's manipulations set Anakin on edge. He questioned who truly had the power to save Padme. At last, the pivot came. The Jedi confronted Palpatine and discovered he was Darth Sidious, the Sith Lord behind the war. In that confrontation, Mace Windu and his companions marched to arrest him, and Anakin found himself in the midst of a critical choice. In canon, that was when Sidious revealed the power to save Padme and twisted Anakin's loyalty. But in this altered thread of fate, just before Anakin left to join Mace at Palpatine's office, he received a cryptic Force message from Plagueis. "The time is now. I can show you what Sidious never could." In a surge of agitation and desperation, Anakin broke off from the Jedi Temple. Instead of heading to Palpatine's office, he followed the data chip coordinates to the dingy sublevels of Coruscant. He navigated labyrinthine walkways and flickering neon corridors until he arrived at an abandoned medical facility, concealed behind a half-collapsed commercial district. The ancient sign overhead flickered with letters half-burnt out. Inside, the lights were dim, the smell of disinfectant and stale air lingering. Strange contraptions and vials cluttered the shelves, reminiscent of old biological experiments. There, in the center of the largest room, stood Plagueis. Gone was the battered breath mask. Instead, a dark cowl covered most of his features, revealing only a gaunt, pale chin and a pair of sunken eyes. He greeted Anakin with a quiet smile. The force around him pulsed with an unnatural hush. Though Anakin found the man's appearance unsettling, he was drawn by a feeling of inevitability. The power exuded by Plagueis felt like a deep well, ancient and terrifying. Sensing the events transpiring above, Plagueis calmly informed Anakin that Sidious was the one who orchestrated the Clone Wars, that he had manipulated both the Separatists and the Republic. He revealed that Sidious had murdered his own master in search of power, never learning the true secrets of conquering death. Shock flooded Anakin. He realized that if Plagueis spoke the truth, then Palpatine might not actually hold the key to saving Padme. Torn by betrayal, Anakin clenched his fists, anger coursing through him. Anakin looked into Plagueis' sunken eyes, searching for sincerity or deception. The hatred he felt for Sidious's manipulations, the desire to protect Padme, the curiosity about his own origins, it all roiled together. He asked Plagueis how to learn this power. The old master gave him a level gaze and said, "Surrender your preconceived notions. Abandon the illusions of the Jedi and the manipulations of the Sith. Embrace the Force as a totality, in both darkness and light. Only then can you command life itself." The words rang as a twisted echo of the Jedi Code, subverted to suit Plagueis' dark ambitions. Yet the idea of harnessing both sides of the Force enticed Anakin. He had never fully fit the mold of a Jedi. The dark side had beckoned him in times of anger or loss, while the light side guided him in times of nobility and compassion. Maybe Plagueis' approach was the key. Anakin felt a maelstrom of conflict tear at him. Yet in the end, one thought, Padme, decided his course. He nodded, stepping forward, agreeing to learn from Plagueis. A faint, triumphant smile curved across Plagueis' lips. He directed Anakin to kneel before him in that makeshift laboratory. If the Jedi had not been so consumed by terror for Padme's life, he might have realized that kneeling was a symbolic act, reminiscent of the Sith tradition of master and apprentice. Plagueis placed a hand on Anakin's brow, and the old master's voice fell into a hypnotic cadence, guiding Anakin into a trance that slipped his consciousness into the deeper currents of the Force. Plagueis began to teach him a forbidden method: how to sense and communicate with the midichlorians themselves, to feel their threads weaving in and out of living tissue, to nudge them with willpower. First, Anakin's mind recoiled. The Jedi had never approached the Force like this, dissecting life down to its smallest components and seizing control. But Plagueis encouraged him, urging him to let go of fear, to let the need to save Padme become his impetus. The darkness in Anakin's heart flared, filling him with intense focus. He began to sense swirling patterns of life as though they were luminous threads in a vast tapestry. Under Plagueis' guidance, Anakin brushed the threads, feeling them respond. The moment carried a sickening sense of awe. Meanwhile, across the city planet, Sidious unleashed a flurry of dark side power to defend himself from the Jedi. Mace Windu eventually gained the upper hand, deflecting Sidious's lightning back into him, scarring his face. Yet with Anakin absent, Sidious had no ally to intervene. In desperation, Sidious tried to claim that he was the only one who knew how to save Anakin's wife from death. Mace pressed forward to strike, determined to end the Sith. But the cunning of Sidious was great, and at the last moment, the Chancellor unleashed a surge of lightning that knocked Mace back. The resulting explosion of Force energies sent both men sprawling, grievously wounded, but not yet dead. In the shadows of the abandoned facility, Plagueis felt a tremor in the Force. He knew Sidious was on the verge of death or capture. The old master's dark satisfaction swelled. The threads of his plan had woven together more perfectly than he dared hope. With Anakin at his side, the future was his to claim. He quietly told Anakin that he felt a dramatic shift in the Force, that the Sith embodied by Sidious was faltering. If Anakin wished to truly free himself and preserve Padme, now was the moment to sever all ties to the old ways. He must join Plagueis fully, a partnership that would surpass the limited master-apprentice dynamic. They would venture together beyond the boundaries of Jedi or Sith, forging a new path. Anakin, immersed in that terrifying new sense of control over life energies, shuddered. The notion that he could be liberated from the codes of both the Jedi and the Sith was seductive, but it also felt dangerously unmoored. He thought of Padmé's safety. He thought of the child or children she carried. The war was tearing the galaxy apart. Perhaps if he gained this knowledge, he could end the conflict, save her, and restore some semblance of peace. Anakin rose to his feet, eyes luminous with determination, and agreed. Plagueis gave a slight bow, as if greeting an equal, though in his mind, he still intended to maintain dominance. Above them, Palpatine's office was in chaos. Mace Windu was injured but alive, and Sidious was barely clinging to consciousness. The other Jedi arrived, swiftly apprehending the broken Sith Lord. Confusion reigned as the war's orchestrator was unmasked. Word spread through the holonet that Chancellor Palpatine was a traitor responsible for the conflict. The Senate was paralyzed by shock, and the Jedi took control of the government for the moment, uncertain how to proceed. In the swirl of confusion, Plagueis' lab remained unnoticed. Over the next hours, Anakin underwent a crash course in Plagueis' rituals and meditations. They delved deep into the darkest corners of the Force. Plagueis used half-organic, half-mechanical devices to measure fluctuations of midichlorians in Anakin's blood. The old master marveled at the results. Anakin's connection was even stronger than he had theorized. If there was ever a being capable of achieving the final threshold, it was this man. Plagueis could see the boy's infinite potential, the living nexus he embodied. Plagueis, for the first time in his life, felt the intoxication of having not only a protege but also the very instrument he had once tried to shape into existence. Yet Plagueis was careful. He knew he had to foster trust and loyalty in Anakin. He taught just enough to keep him hungry. For his part, Anakin practiced using the Force to mend small injuries on Plagueis' test subjects, creatures the old master had captured or grown in vats. Each success stoked Anakin's confidence, but also a creeping horror at the unnatural methods used. Plagueis explained that life required sacrifice, that the transformation of knowledge demanded sometimes brutal experiments. Anakin grit his teeth, pushing forward for the sake of Padmé. All the while, the Jedi searched frantically for Anakin. Obi-Wan Kenobi, in particular, grew alarmed by his friend's disappearance. The Council broadcast calls across Coruscant, across the galaxy. Freed from the manipulations of Palpatine, the Jedi realized the significance of Anakin as the Chosen One might be greater than they ever understood. Yoda felt the stir of a grave new presence lurking in the Force. He sensed that something more ancient than Sidious had awakened. Fearing that Anakin had fallen to a darker path, Obi-Wan and several other masters started combing through the labyrinth of Coruscant's underworld. Their search was hindered by the remains of the war's chaos. Clashes still broke out in pockets where separatist droids had not yet been deactivated. They also faced confusion within the Senate and the public, who were learning that they had been governed by a Sith Lord. The galaxy teetered on the brink of anarchy, with the Jedi desperately trying to maintain order. Anakin's absence was a gaping void. Padmé, frantic and nearing labor, pleaded with the Jedi to find him. She confided in Obi-Wan her fears that Anakin might do something terrible if he felt he had no other choice to save her. Deep in the abandoned facility, Plagueis decided to push Anakin further. He revealed an ancient Sith holocron, one he had taken from the archives of the Mun homeworld, and claimed it contained knowledge older than the Republic, knowledge that predated the Jedi Order. He guided Anakin through a vile incantation that demanded a sacrifice of living energy. Plagueis claimed it was a necessity for bridging the gap between ordinary healing and actually preventing death. The process required harnessing the agony of a living being and transforming it into an infusion of life for the intended recipient. Appalled, Anakin balked. He had known the dark side was a place of cruelty, but this was beyond anything he had encountered. He argued that there must be another way. Plagueis glared, stepping closer. "You want to save your wife from death, yet you hesitate?" he hissed. "Life demands balance. To cheat death for one, another must give. This is the oldest law, the one the Jedi never speak of. There is no power without cost." Anakin trembled. In a tormented whisper, he asked if it truly had to be so. Plagueis responded with cold assurance that no lesser method would suffice if Padme's life was indeed threatened by the Force's design. The Force demanded exchange. The old master further manipulated Anakin by suggesting that the countless lives lost in the Clone Wars were the real tragedy. So what was one more if it could ensure Padme's survival? And potentially end all wars by giving Anakin the power to shape destiny? Confusion and guilt gnawed at Anakin. He wanted to spare a life, to remain a good man, but the nightmares of Padme's death flashed in his mind. Weighing her life against a stranger's, the dark seeds in his heart sprouted. Slowly, with tears brimming in his eyes, Anakin swallowed his conscience. He gripped his lightsaber. If what Plagueis said was true, then the code of the Jedi, the morality he once clung to, all seemed powerless to save her. He was about to become something else entirely. In the corridor behind them, a presence approached. Plagueis sensed it and hissed at Anakin to be ready. Through the battered doorway stepped Obi-Wan Kenobi, lightsaber lit. Behind him, Ahsoka Tano, having returned from her own exile to assist in the crisis, stood with lightsabers in hand. They beheld the horrific apparatus, the stasis pods, the shadow-laden presence of Plagueis. Obi-Wan's eyes flickered with anguish as he looked at Anakin's tear-streaked face. He pleaded for his friend to step away from the darkness, to remember who he was. Ahsoka glared at Plagueis, clearly sensing the depth of his evil. She tried to reach out to Anakin, reminding him of how his compassion had once saved her life and led her to trust him wholeheartedly. She spoke of the ideals Anakin had championed, the good man he was. For a moment, Anakin faltered, the compassion within him reasserting itself. Plagueis, cold and cunning, stepped to Anakin's side, reminding him softly of Padme and the child. The doubt returned to Anakin's features. Obi-Wan attempted to reason with Plagueis, but the ancient Sith master recognized no authority in the Jedi. He sneered, calling them blind custodians of half-truths, and claimed they allowed entire planets to burn in the war. Obi-Wan insisted that Plagueis was twisting Anakin's fears. He raised his lightsaber, prepared to battle if necessary. Plagueis raised a thin hand, calling on the Force. He was still weak in body from his near-death and years of hiding, but his knowledge and cunning were formidable. Loose debris in the lab hurled toward Obi-Wan and Ahsoka, forcing them to move. Then Plagueis whispered to Anakin that this was the moment to prove his commitment. If Anakin struck down Obi-Wan, the final chain of his old life would be severed, clearing his path to absolute freedom. Fear clashed with fury in Anakin's soul. He did not want to kill Obi-Wan, who had been like a brother to him, yet his mind was plagued by the thought of losing Padme. Everything hinged on Plagueis' secret. If he disobeyed Plagueis now, would that knowledge vanish forever? Obi-Wan sensed the conflict and tried desperately to push through the swirling debris, calling Anakin's name. Ahsoka, lithe and agile, leapt over a toppled piece of machinery, parrying the next wave of telekinetic assault. She locked eyes with Anakin, pleading with him to see sense. "We'll find another way," she said, voice trembling with emotion. "Don't let this monster make you destroy everything you love." Her words stirred a flicker of shame in Anakin. Before he could reply, Plagueis lunged forward, hurling a lance of lightning toward Ahsoka. She crossed her sabers in defense, but the force of the blow sent her skidding back. Obi-Wan dashed forward, engaging Plagueis with his blade. The old Sith blocked with a red lightsaber he produced from beneath his robes. Though not as physically imposing as Sidious, Plagueis' moves were precise, backed by centuries of esoteric knowledge. He parried Obi-Wan's strikes with surprising deftness, while continuing to hurl bursts of force energy to keep Ahsoka at bay. The lab erupted in chaos. Tanks shattered as debris flew. Sparks rained from overhead cables severed in the fray. Glass crunched underfoot. Anakin stood amid the swirling conflict, internal war tearing him apart. If he helped Obi-Wan and Ahsoka defeat Plagueis, Padme's last hope of salvation might be lost. If he assisted Plagueis, he might save Padme but would confirm his fall. In that moment, he remembered Padme's gentle words that nothing was worth losing one's soul. He heard Ahsoka calling out, "You're stronger than this," Sky Guy. He saw Obi-Wan's open, pleading expression, sweat on his brow as he dueled the Dark Master. And still Plagueis' harsh whisper burned in his mind. If you falter, your child will grow up without a mother. Padme will die, and all will be wasted. The fight intensified. Plagueis slammed a wave of force energy into Obi-Wan, sending him crashing into a row of equipment. Ahsoka twirled her blades, launching a counterattack that forced Plagueis to pivot. The old master grimaced, his stamina waning. He needed Anakin to intervene. He reached out through the Force, seizing Anakin's psyche in a vice grip of desperation. Strike them down, my son of the Force. Complete your destiny. Anakin's eyes flashed with a swirl of emotions. He flicked his lightsaber on. He stepped forward, uncertain. Ahsoka noticed and braced herself. Obi-Wan groaned, struggling to his feet, gazing at Anakin with sorrow. The moment stretched, razor sharp. Then Anakin roared, bringing his blade up in an overhead swing. Plagueis' eyes lit with exultation, only to twist in horror as the blade came down upon him. The old master reacted with serpentine reflexes, blocking at the last moment, but Anakin's strike carried the unstoppable momentum of the Chosen One. Plagueis' lightsaber screeched as it was forced aside, and Anakin's blade carved into Plagueis' chest. A gasp tore from Plagueis' lips. Shock riddled his face as he realized that Anakin had turned on him. In a final, desperate attempt, Plagueis tried to unleash his full Force power, but his body, never fully recovered from Sidious's assassination attempt years ago, simply could not channel it. With a trembling hand, Plagueis tried to hold Anakin's gaze. "Fool," he hissed, "you forfeit her life. All you love will die, and all you have gained is emptiness." Anakin's face contorted with pain as he withdrew the blade, stepping back. "I will find another way," he whispered. Plagueis collapsed, the energies sustaining him unraveling, his last breath rattling through the gloom. A hush followed, broken only by the crackle of ruined machinery. Obi-Wan and Ahsoka watched with a mixture of relief and sadness. They saw the torment in Anakin's eyes. They rushed forward to him, but before they could speak, Anakin sank to his knees, trembling. The weight of what he had done, the near alliance with darkness, the betrayal of Plagueis, the betrayal of the Jedi threatened to crush him. He had embraced so many forbidden emotions to get here, and at the final moment, he had chosen to kill Plagueis rather than destroy his own friends. But had he doomed Padme by doing so? Ahsoka knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder, while Obi-Wan stood quietly, tears in his eyes. The room's flickering lights shone on Plagueis' lifeless form. The dark presence that had haunted Anakin from the shadows for so long was extinguished. Obi-Wan softly said Anakin's name. The younger man looked up, eyes full of sorrow and uncertainty. "Did I just kill the only chance Padme had?" Anakin asked, voice quivering. Obi-Wan tried to reassure him, saying they would find a way through the Jedi's combined knowledge, or perhaps a path in the Force that wasn't so twisted in darkness. Ahsoka nodded, adding that there were healers, that there must be a solution that didn't demand blood sacrifice. Unsure whether to believe them, but devoid of other options, Anakin nodded numbly. The group set about destroying Plagueis' macabre laboratory. Tanks were shattered, data files purged, the body of Plagueis left to burn. They wanted no trace of this unholy place to remain. As the embers glowed, Anakin couldn't escape a lingering fear. Plagueis' claim that the Force demanded exchange. Yet he had chosen to abandon that dark path and keep his soul. Now, he prayed the Force would not punish him by claiming Padme. They emerged from the depths, battered but resolute. Surrounded by the ruin of war, they learned that the Jedi had apprehended Palpatine. The Senate was in disarray, but with the truth exposed, the Separatist leadership also collapsed in confusion. The clones were recalled. A fragile peace began to form as the galaxy grappled with the unimaginable betrayal. Anakin rushed to Padme's side, where she was in labor far earlier than expected due to stress and heartbreak. The Jedi and medical droids did everything they could. Obi-Wan, Yoda, and the healers combined their powers, using the light side in a rare display of synergy. Ahsoka stood by, radiating encouragement. Though complications arose, Padme survived, giving birth to twins, Luke and Leia. Overwhelmed by relief, Anakin held his family close, tears streaming down his cheeks. Perhaps Plagueis had been wrong, or perhaps the Force had granted mercy. Either way, Padme lived, and so did the children. In the following days, the Jedi Council convened. The galaxy faced a massive transition. Palpatine was placed on trial, revealing the entire tapestry of the Sith infiltration. Many in the Senate demanded that the Jedi take a leading role in rebuilding the Republic, but the Jedi hesitated, wary of mixing too closely with politics again. They recognized their failures, their arrogance that allowed a Sith Lord to rise undetected. Meanwhile, Obi-Wan and Yoda spoke quietly of the old prophecy. The Chosen One was meant to bring balance, and though Anakin had been teetering on the brink, something had guided him to reject the darkness at the last possible moment. Anakin, however, felt a deep wound within. He had stared into the darkest knowledge, had nearly made the ultimate sacrifice of his soul, all for fear of losing Padme. He had killed Plagueis, but the echoes of that encounter haunted him. At night, he dreamed of Plagueis' final words, those sunken eyes promising that all he loved would still die. Guilt and remorse weighed heavily, but seeing Padme and the twins safe eased his torment. With the war over, he hoped to resign from the Jedi Order, to devote himself to his family and perhaps chart a new path. But the Force still whispered. In the weeks after the war's end, an uneasy calm settled over Coruscant. While the Senate attempted to restructure, the Jedi tried to reaffirm their role as peacekeepers. The clones, freed from Palpatine's commands, were left directionless, many returning to Kamino or seeking new identities. A shattered galaxy yearned for unity. In this fragile environment, Anakin and Padme lived in a modest apartment near the Senate district. Freed of secrets, they focused on their children. Yet a question loomed. Would the Jedi allow Anakin to simply leave? And would the galaxy remain stable without a robust guiding hand? Obi-Wan visited Anakin often. Their relationship was frayed but intact. They spoke of the old days of Qui-Gon's ideals. Obi-Wan encouraged Anakin to return to the temple, at least to help reorganize the Jedi. Anakin was torn. He felt that the Jedi Council's rigidity and the manipulations of Palpatine had both contributed to the war. He questioned whether the galaxy needed a new philosophy of the Force, not the dogmatic extremes of the Jedi or the Sith, but something in between. He recalled Plagueis' talk of uniting dark and light. Even though Plagueis' path had been twisted and vile, maybe there was a kernel of truth about the Force's wholeness. During one of these conversations, Yoda and Mace Windu joined Obi-Wan in visiting Anakin. Mace had survived Sidious's assault but bore the scars. He regarded Anakin with more humility than ever before, acknowledging that the Council had erred in its treatment of him. Yoda spoke softly of the prophecy, how the Force was in flux, and how Anakin's choices would continue to shape the galaxy. A balance found, you may have, Yoda said, but uncertain, the future is. Much healing remains. Anakin hesitated to rejoin the Order. He proposed a different path, that the Jedi might open themselves to a broader study of the Force, to understand the shadows they had neglected. Mace bristled at that, still seeing the dark side as an absolute threat. But Yoda seemed contemplative. The war had revealed the dangers of ignorance. Though the conversation remained unresolved, it planted a seed of reformation. Meanwhile, rumors spread throughout the underbelly of Coruscant that Plagueis' lab had been destroyed. Some whispered that Plagueis' essence might cling to the darkness, that perhaps he was not entirely gone. Others believed that the old master's final secrets had evaporated when he died. Anakin tried to push these rumors from his mind, wanting only to secure his family's safety. But the Force is never static for long. As months passed, pockets of loyalists to the Separatists or to Palpatine stirred up insurrections across the galaxy. Fear, anger, and greed did not vanish overnight. The Senate quibbled endlessly on how to reorganize the vast systems. The Jedi found themselves stretched thin once more. By now, Anakin had returned in a limited capacity, primarily to help quell violence and restore order. He insisted on spending as much time as possible with Padme and the children, but the call of the Force was unrelenting. Luke and Leia grew quickly, Force potential shimmering in their tiny forms. Anakin dreaded the day they might become pawns in some new conflict. As the newborn twins giggled in their crib one morning, Padme gently ran a hand through Anakin's hair, sensing his conflict. She told him that the galaxy needed hope, needed someone who had witnessed the brink of darkness and chosen to turn away. She reminded him that there was a reason he was the chosen one, that perhaps the Force called him to shape a new era, so that Luke and Leia could grow up in a universe free of the cyclical violence. Anakin held her gaze, acknowledging that she was right. Although Plagueis was gone, his memory served as a reminder of the horrifying cost of the old ways. So Anakin began to spearhead quiet reforms. He worked alongside Obi-Wan, Ahsoka, and even Mace Windu, who had grown more introspective after his near-fatal duel. They proposed that the Jedi train not only in the light side but also in understanding the triggers of the dark side. Instead of absolute denial, they sought awareness. Some Jedi disagreed, believing this was too close to heresy. Others, especially younger knights, saw value in broadening the Order's perspective. Master Yoda watched carefully, allowing debate, sensing that evolution might be necessary for the Order's survival. In the legislative sphere, Padme and other reformist senators struggled to restore trust in the Republic. They advocated more equitable policies, remembering how many systems had been driven to the separatist side by corruption. The process was slow, but the presence of Anakin, celebrated as a war hero, helped garner public support. A battered galaxy yearned for unity, though the scars ran deep. Occasionally, Anakin felt echoes of Plagueis in his mind, like a ghostly laughter mocking him for trying to unify the Force. He worried that Plagueis' spirit lingered, or perhaps it was only his guilty conscience. The memory of nearly sacrificing his moral center haunted him. Yet each day he looked upon Padme, Luke, and Leia, alive and safe. He felt a renewed commitment to forging a better path. The nightmares of her death no longer plagued him, and though the future was uncertain, he held hope that their bond and the resilience of life would endure. Over time, a small wave of new Jedi initiates joined the temple, eager to learn from the famed knight who had nearly succumbed but overcame. Those who had once doubted the prophecy now began to see that Anakin's experience with Plagueis and Sidious had granted him unique insight. He cautioned the younglings that power driven by fear leads only to darkness, yet ignorance of fear leads to blindness. He taught them to acknowledge and transform emotions rather than repress them, forging a tempered will that respected life in all forms. This new approach faced resistance from conservative masters. Some parted ways with the Jedi Order, calling it a betrayal of tradition. But a surprising number of masters, including Plo Koon, Kit Fisto, and others who had seen the tragedy of the war up close, recognized the necessity. Yoda mediated the internal schism with gentle wisdom, reminding them that dogma alone had not prevented the rise of a Sith Lord within their midst. The Order had to evolve or risk a repetition of the past. Anakin wrestled with his own sense of identity in this transitional era. He was neither the wide-eyed Padawan who left Tatooine nor the tormented knight who nearly bowed to Plagueis. Something had changed irrevocably in him. At times, he felt a painful longing for the simplicity of youth, but those days were gone. He instead found purpose in forging something new with his family, the Jedi, and the Republic. Padme saw that the weight of leadership wore upon him, and she did all she could to anchor him with her warmth and unwavering support. Their children, unburdened by prophecy, grew under the watchful eyes of their parents, but the Force swirled around them even in infancy. In quiet moments, Anakin wondered if Luke or Leia might one day discover the same dangerous questions that had ensnared him. He vowed to guide them so they would never be seduced by illusions of quick power. Amid these personal evolutions, the galaxy at large took gradual steps toward reconciliation. With Palpatine exposed, many sectors realized how thoroughly they had been used. The old separatist grudges began to soften, replaced by a desire to heal. The new government, though fragile, sought to invest in rebuilding war-torn systems rather than punishing them. The Jedi, no longer forced into a role as generals, returned to peacekeeping, though with a new humility. People across countless worlds still harbored bitterness, but each day brought a chance for incremental progress. On a quiet night, after months of relative peace, Obi-Wan met Anakin atop one of Coruscant's spires. Together they gazed at the countless lights below. Obi-Wan spoke of how he still felt Qui-Gon's presence guiding him, whispering that the living force was more important than strict adherence to old rules. Anakin glanced at his former master, feeling a rush of gratitude. They spoke of the lost father figure that Qui-Gon had been, how he would likely have supported their reforms, seeing in them an echo of his own unorthodox beliefs. Anakin, eyes glimmering with the reflection of the city's lights, felt a sense of bittersweet pride. Down below, in the darkest underlevels, rumors persisted of strange robed figures rummaging through old experiments. Some said they were cultists searching for Plagueis' remnants. Others claimed to have seen the faint glow of stasis tanks in reactivated chambers. The Jedi occasionally sent patrols but found little evidence. The memory of Plagueis was not easily erased. Fear and greed would continue to draw those who coveted his knowledge. In the months that followed, Ahsoka traveled the galaxy, bridging divides, offering her unique perspective as someone who had left the Jedi Order but returned to help. She became an ambassador of sorts, a living testament that one could serve the light without rigid alignment. She and Anakin stayed close, forging a bond of sibling-like loyalty. Together with Obi-Wan, they formed the bedrock of the reimagined Jedi. Meanwhile, Mace Windu, though physically and emotionally scarred, took a role in reorganizing the temple's structure. With Sidious's infiltration exposed, the Jedi recognized the need for transparency and checks within their own leadership. Mace, once the staunch guardian of tradition, surprised many by endorsing certain reforms. He saw that the old ways had proven vulnerable. He told Anakin that though he still distrusted the pull of the dark side, he admired the younger man's commitment to forging a better future. A year passed then too. The galaxy slowly stabilized. Reconstruction efforts blossomed, and the new Senate hammered out laws that tried to diminish corruption. At times, the rifts from the Clone Wars flared up, but the looming shadow of Sidious's manipulations had taught many the cost of deception. The Jedi Order, restructured and introspective, found a new acceptance among the public. Freed from the role of generals, they provided peacekeeping and humanitarian aid, rebuilding trust. Luke and Leia grew into toddling children with bright eyes and sharper senses than most. They giggled as they pulled at Anakin's mechanical arm or grabbed Obi-Wan's beard. They formed a strong bond with Ahsoka, calling her Auntie Sokka. Padme watched them fondly, relieved that the darkness that nearly claimed Anakin seemed far away. Yet Anakin, haunted by his brush with Plagueis, remained vigilant. He studied healing techniques in the Jedi archives, determined to ensure no one else would ever be seduced by the false promise of forcibly twisting the Force to halt death. He believed that compassion, not control, was the path to sustaining life. In an effort to truly bury Plagueis' legacy, Anakin led an expedition to the Mune homeworld to search for any hidden archives or labs Plagueis might have left behind. Obi-Wan and Ahsoka accompanied him, with the blessing of the Council. On Munalinst, they unearthed an old fortress rumored to have once belonged to Plagueis. Inside, they found dusty tomes and bizarre contraptions for manipulating life essences. Among them, they uncovered a near-complete record of Plagueis' greatest experiment, an attempt to create life from midichlorians. The notes were cryptic, yet they confirmed that Plagueis believed he had succeeded. Anakin was the result. The shock of seeing it in writing left Anakin weak at the knees. It was true, then. Plagueis had essentially fathered him through the Force. The revelation rattled him, causing a surge of anger and sorrow. Obi-Wan and Ahsoka looked on with concern. They asked if he wanted the records destroyed. Anakin hesitated, then decided the Jedi should preserve them, but hidden away so no one would repeat such a twisted endeavor. He reasoned that knowledge, even terrible knowledge, should not be lost entirely, but kept safe to prevent future atrocities. A grim resolution filled him as he oversaw the fortress's final clearance. The darkest corners of Plagueis' legacy would remain locked under Jedi protection. They returned to Coruscant, burdened but resolute. Anakin confided the full truth to Padme, that Plagueis had manipulated the Force to conceive him. She embraced him, telling him that it did not change who he was as a person, that his choices determined his identity, not his origin. Her words soothed him. Together, they faced the new reality that, in some sense, Plagueis had been Anakin's progenitor, even if indirectly. That knowledge, however, was overshadowed by what truly mattered: their family and the new era they were helping shape. More time passed, and the Jedi continued to evolve. The once dogmatic council was now more open and collaborative, drawing on lessons from the war and from Anakin's near downfall. Luke and Leia grew, occasionally showing small manifestations of the Force, guided by their father's gentle lessons that curiosity must be balanced with compassion. The galaxy at large had not achieved perfect harmony, but for the first time in decades, there was a genuine feeling of hope. People looked to the future with cautious optimism. Plagueis' name became a shadowy footnote in history, a cautionary tale of hubris. Some whisperers in the underworld insisted that Plagueis' spirit still haunted the edges of the Force, waiting for another host. But none could confirm such rumors. The tension that once threatened to tear the galaxy asunder had subsided into the normal challenges of governance and reconstruction. With Sidious awaiting trial and no new Sith rising to claim the mantle, the reign of the dark side receded. Anakin eventually accepted a seat on the newly formed Council of Reconciliation, a small body that acted to unify the Senate, Jedi, and other stakeholders. Though he never fully returned to the old ways of the Jedi, he served as a bridge, a living testament to the complexities of the Force. He retained the rank of Jedi Knight, refusing the title of Master, believing he still had much to learn. Many admired his humility. On the day of Palpatine's sentencing, the Senate chamber was filled with delegates from every corner of the galaxy. Surrounded by security, the once mighty Darth Sidious was brought forth in restraints. His disfigured face twisted in malice as he spotted Anakin in the gallery. The two locked eyes. Sidious recognized he had lost. Without Anakin's presence to intervene, Sidious had been unable to slay Mace Windu, and the Jedi's collective might had subdued him. His cunning had failed. Anakin stared back, feeling only pity for the once powerful Sith. He thought of Plagueis, how that cunning had first destroyed him, and how Plagueis had returned from the brink to attempt to guide Anakin himself. In the end, both Sith Lords had fallen to their own hubris. When the sentence was passed, Sidious howled that Anakin would never save Padme, that her demise was inevitable, that all life was ephemeral. But Anakin knew better now. The illusions of the Sith no longer held him. Padme was alive, healthy, and in the gallery with their twins, a testament that love and perseverance could prevail over fear. The Senate erupted in confirmation of the verdict, and Sidious was led away, cursing them all. In the aftermath, Anakin stood in a side corridor with Padme, Obi-Wan, and Ahsoka. He embraced them, letting out a long breath. This chapter was finally closing. That night, the family returned home, the children asleep in their arms. Anakin gently tucked Luke and Leia into bed, kissing their foreheads. He gazed at them for a long moment, remembering how close he had come to dooming all of this by embracing Plagueis' path. The price of that knowledge had been too high. In the end, he had chosen love over fear. He had chosen not to become a monster. Years later, children in the temple would whisper of the legendary time the Chosen One nearly fell to the darkest teacher imaginable, only to turn away at the final instant. Some said it was luck, others said it was destiny. The truth was perhaps more personal. Anakin's bond with Obi-Wan and Ahsoka, his love for Padme, the living essence of the Force itself guiding him. They all converged to break Plagueis' hold. In so doing, Anakin emerged with a perspective that neither Jedi nor Sith had ever fully achieved. A sense of the Force as an infinite tapestry, not to be controlled by fear but guided with compassion. In the following decades, as Luke and Leia grew, they were taught the complexities of their father's path. They learned that darkness and light existed in all beings, that arrogance and fear were the truest enemies. They grew up in a galaxy still healing, but with a legacy of lessons gleaned from the brink of ruin. The Jedi Order, reformed and introspective, served as beacons of tempered knowledge, no longer blind to their own weaknesses. The Republic's new structure, championed by Padme and other reformers, had a better chance of lasting peace. Yet even in that hopeful age, the memory of Plagueis remained like a scar, reminding all who knew the tale that immortality sought through twisted means could only lead to ruin. The darkest corners of the Force were not banished, only held in check by vigilance and unity. Anakin, whenever doubts surfaced, remembered the sight of Plagueis' final expression: shock, betrayal, and the realization that the Chosen One had refused to bow. That memory was a caution against hubris for them all. And so, with Plagueis truly gone this time, the galaxy entered a new era, shaped by the one who was born of his manipulations. Anakin, no longer simply a Jedi or a Sith, forged a path that embraced the totality of the Force in service of life. The children of the Force, Luke and Leia, thrived in a kinder galaxy. Though challenges lay ahead, the cycle of darkness that had spanned millennia was finally broken. The Force, in its boundless mystery, watched as its Chosen One guided the future toward an enduring balance. And if, in the quiet hours of night, the faint echo of Plagueis' voice haunted Anakin's dreams, whispering promises of untold power, it only served as a reminder of the choice he had made, and of the path he had chosen. For in life, as in the Force, there is always a price, but it need not always be paid in blood. Anakin had broken the chain of endless Sith betrayal, casting aside Plagueis' ultimate lure. And in doing so, he won for himself and his loved ones that most precious power of all: the chance to live freely, unbound by the fear of death or the shackles of destiny.